So I have been following the work of Tim Fletcher lately. He works with people to support their complex trauma and particularly complex trauma's relationship to addiction. And through all of that, I am learning how shame is a major factor in that and the victim complex. And I've talked about the victim complex, and I can't help but see that there's a relationship to narcissism as well in there. That usually this sort of intense self focus around shame creates this narcissistic self focus. Now, the word narcissism is always used in this weaponizing kind of way, and I don't actually think it's helpful for anyone to approach it in that sense. Much of the time, narcissism creates this intense self focus because there have been a circumstance that someone had to become so self focused, right? Some sort of trauma. And that gets into some complicated nuance, and I'm not a teacher of that. And I offer that Tim Fletcher is way better at that sort of thing. But I think it is generally interesting to think about how narcissism and victimhood are inherently linked. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me that if you search for victim or narcissism in terms of psychological stuff on like YouTube, you'll typically see the more conservative person talking about victims, and you'll see the more liberal person talking about narcissists. And so it feels like kind of a collective unconscious ego split that's a bit going on. But I think there are two sides of the same coin. And I think it does have a lot to do with both complex trauma and the fact that we can get very much caught up in codependent drama triangle games. And so I wanted to talk about the markers of loneliness in relation to something like this. Because the idea of narcissism being that we are so self-focused is something that creates a feeling of being alone. And when you're alone, there's basically a couple of different ways to combat that. It is one, getting into a fight stance. You have to be hyper vigilant and maybe overwork yourself or be in some sort of overly protected mode because you are alone, and that requires vigilance. The only way to truly rest and get deep rest, which is another concept I want to talk about, you have to be able to rest into knowing that someone else has got it, or that you are protected, or that you are cared for. And if you don't feel that or believe that in your soma, in your body, in your mind, in your heart, then you won't get the deep rest that you need. And I also believe that suicidal ideation has a lot to do with a desire for deep rest. That most of the time, I've talked about this in past episodes too, that a suicidal ideation has a lot to do with taking ourselves too seriously. I've used the phrase that self-seriousness equals self-destruction. And in a way, when we get into the term covert narcissism, which I've heard thrown around a lot lately, that is something where we are really experiencing that brand of self-focus that does lead to shame spirals and self-destruction. And it's tricky because when we are in a shame spiral or we're dysregulated by our external circumstances, by triggers, by feeling alone, by fears of what will inundate us, then yeah, we get defensive. We get, it's really hard for us to believe that anyone can be there for us or anyone can care for us. So if you were abandoned as a child or rejected often, or because of that happening so young, you create the belief that you're not valuable and that you are desiring to perpetuate that rejection, because in a way that's what you believe to be comfortable after a while. So it creates a persistent self-sabotage, which Tim Fletcher also talks about in great detail. So there are a couple great videos of his that I watched. One was about self-sabotage and failure. Another has to do with shame. Shame is pretty important to talk about if you're dealing with complex trauma. And I can't remember the other that I was about to say, but there is a lot of videos he talks about victim consciousness and narcissism and all of these various ideas. And so I think ultimately, if we are dealing with the shame and having this intense shame spiral, and then we connect that to suicidal ideation and this desire for deep rest, if we are constantly feeling like we are alone, whether that's being reflected in having so much awareness of what's happening in the world and a certain helplessness to do anything about it, that can make someone feel very alone. If your expectations of yourself are really high and you can't meet them, that can make you feel very helpless and alone. And if you have complex trauma and for some reason have this psychological cycle of spiraling, of self-defeating, of self-sabotaging, of maintaining a victim stance, which paradoxically is a superiority complex, because you have to treat yourself as the most important thing, or have had to. We end up overvaluing ourselves by undervaluing ourselves in a weird way, right? We overvalue ourselves by pushing people away, and when we push people away, we end up alone. And by ending up alone, we create that feeling of suicidal ideation, that need for deep rest. And it's just this we need other people in our life. We need to be of service in our life in some way, shape, or form. And to know that we can care and that we're cared for allows for us to actually rest into getting the rest that we need, and can let go of all of the other addictions that we grab onto to feel a sense of aliveness and okayness. What Tim also talks about is addictions quite a bit. And he talks about the 12 needs. I'm not going to remember all the 12 needs off the top of my head, but you can easily search for Tim Fletcher 12 needs. And if I can try to list them, I think it's pleasure, which is non-addictive pleasure, like the joy of taste in our senses. And most of our motivations and drives are for some sort of pleasure. Physical needs, so water, food, shelter, things like that. Relational needs, close friends, support, hugs, a sense of trust, sex and procreation. And I'm going to include creativity in there also. Is the desire to create something beyond yourself. And so, like, sex is also an intimacy thing, but it is also a pleasure thing, and it's also a part of reproducing, right? So when people can't reproduce, maybe they have like issues with their reproductive stuff going on. Uh, they can take on a big project and feel that sense of having created something. Some people can get addicted to procreating and having a baby, and then that baby grows up and develops an ego, and then that ego fights them, and so they have another baby. You get kind of addicted to merging with an entity that, you can kind of put forth a narrative that they love you unconditionally, until there are conditional things to contend with. Um, so let's see, it was physical, relational, pleasure, reproductive. Their spiritual needs, wholeness needs, which is meeting all of the needs, a sense of purpose, a sense of awe and wonder is another one, and probably the ones I don't remember are blind spots for me. So that'll be interesting to go back and take a look at. But these 12 needs are important for us to get met throughout our day and throughout our lives. But addictions are often overdoing them. So it's like underdoing one of them by overdoing another one. It kind of makes a zero-sum game out of these 12 needs. So if you're underdoing a sense of purpose, you might overdo a sense of synthetic pleasure. You can have a sex addiction because maybe your relational needs are not being met, or something like that. And I suspect that there are specific links between each one. I don't know if Tim covers that or goes into much detail there, but I suspect he has, because a lot of his work is very sophisticated. So it's been helping me to understand these various aspects that I'm talking about. I'm getting very informational because I'm sort of brain dumping, and I've been feeding my brain a lot of stuff, and I just need somewhere to put it. And as much as I'm not treating dopamine as like a business anymore, I still am trying to coalesce all of this. This is me meeting a creativity need to just sort of share, and a little bit of a relational need, I think, in the sense that I don't really have the full breadth of ability in my life to just sort of spout all of this at someone, right? My wife has her limits, different personality types, and all of that, So this gives me a chance to just kind of rant and ramble, and you can listen if this helps you or not. But for me and my story, I think I'm unraveling a lot of my relationship to failure and self-sabotage, noticing a lot of how I'm afraid of criticism, massively afraid of criticism. It might be an Enneagram 1 thing. I know that when I was a kid, there was a lot of criticism towards me and anything that I did. It was like this paradoxical trap of criticized if you do it, criticized if you don't do it, and criticized if you rest, which makes resting very difficult. And so I'm trying to connect rest to, like I said, the idea of suicidal ideation. And if you're feeling this sense of suicidal ideation, I do suspect it has to do with needing deep rest. And for me, who has gotten criticism often about resting, then you can feel this sense of like, well, if I'm not allowed to rest, then of course, like a way out is to end it all. And so, I mean, what greater rest is there than death? you know? And I think our relationship to suicidal ideation is often assumed to be a violent thing, which is why people can't really go through with it. I mean, most of the time, someone would like jump or drown or take pills or something that will be this sort of leap or some sort of like, I can't come back from it, because the desire is to let go. It ultimately is the desire to let go. And it's always about stress. It's always about feeling like such a heavy burden. And that's another aspect that came up in Tim's work is feeling like a burden. And so for me, it's like this full-fledged multi-directional thing around shame, letting go of shame, letting go of this fear of criticism. And it's very difficult and very sensitive. I'm trying to, first of all, embrace the sensitivity and understand that, yes, I am a very sensitive person. I've talked about it for 500 episodes or so now. And I am sensitive to criticism, which has kept me from learning new skills that would put me in situations where I may potentially be criticized. And so it's very much held me back from what I feel is a greater potential that I have. And so I am practicing that with little things like cooking and trying new things that I've never done before, that just involves not only following instructions, but involves potentially getting feedback from someone like my kids, who are little id creatures who will say if they don't like something, right? So it's very much like overcoming the fear and then also depersonalizing the fear. So like recognizing that any criticism is not necessarily about me, and that that I need to let that go, and just self-soothe. And some of the self-soothing techniques are being gentler and kinder with myself, literally self-touch, like touching my head or my arms, or just kind of patting myself, just remembering that I have a mind-body connection. That's pretty important. And just talking to my younger self, and much of it for me is remembering that it's okay for me to ultimately pursue pleasure, especially in the face of what I've talked about with like porn addiction and other addictions that I have around food and such. It can keep me from wanting to experience pleasure with food or pleasure with physical sex and other aspects of life that require potentially getting into the realm of addictions. You can get addicted to pleasure, or not pleasure, purpose. You can get addicted to pleasure, of course. but you can get addicted to purpose through, like, busy work and not having an impact, but pursuing an impact. So you get the cheap hits of accomplishing tasks, but it doesn't actually fulfill the core need and doesn't lead to rest. Ultimately, it does need to rest. I think rest is also one of the needs, uh, which is important, right? So the deep rest, and deep rest is also a spiritual concept I got from a Modama, about really letting go of the chatter of the mind. Meditation, prayer is super helpful for those things. And so that's really good for those moments where you can learn meditation and then take those moments to just allow yourself to say, there's nothing in my care or responsibility right now. Everything is handled. And it's really just like a belief and saying, letting the chatter stop of like, no, actually, if you literally look around at what is happening right now, in a scenario yesterday, for example, my kids they're playing games. My son is playing with toys. My daughter is playing Roblox. My wife is watching a movie or something. They're all fed. Everyone's happy. I can lay on the couch and close my eyes. And I did. I did for 20 minutes while something was in the oven or something like that. And that was wonderful. And it doesn't take a lot. And I think that's, for me, is realizing it doesn't take a lot. All of these needs don't necessarily take a lot. They take switching between them all. And there's a lot of things to be aware of, especially if there are not things that you were used to tending to. So some of the ones you maybe have underdone or overdone, you need to pay some new attention to and rebalance the scales in a sense. And I think that's what I'm personally working on. And in a lot of ways, it's also letting go of the past. So the victimhood thing and the narcissism thing is basically saying, like, why does this always happen to me? Why is my past such an awful thing? And really specializing, like making yourself special. I was really going to do an episode that was called, like, You're Not Special. And I'm kind of just working that into here, really. And there's a quote I try to remember all the time, is like, what makes you so special that you're not deserving of love? And for me, experiencing unconditional love is just a completely new thing. It's just totally new. And part of the work that Tim talks about is starting to develop a surrogate family. It's finding people who are healthier for you, finding people who are supportive and there for you, and who are not representative of bad behaviors or enablers or anything like that, and being patient with that pursuit. And for me, I have been starting to find some of those people. And it is incredibly helpful to allow myself to immerse in those people and trust in them. And my family is one of those situations where I can close my eyes on the couch and I can trust that if their needs are handled, I can handle my needs as well. And that today, for example, as well, I had spent all week taking care of the kids when Molly's at work, and we had another thing today where we were going to take the kids to their grandparents' house, and Molly asked me if I was going to join, and I actually decided to say no. I think I've done my service for the week. Actually, I think I'm going to take the rest. And rest really requires doing something you enjoy. That's the pleasure component. Or the meditation component. Meditation is pleasurable, to let your mind relax and be tuned to the environment and not panic about anything. That is pretty nice. It's a really wonderful thing. So, doing this podcast episode is very enjoyable for me to get these thoughts out, to kind of feel like a smart person. But really, it's like all of these details that I've been absorbing over the past 2 weeks or so are starting to coalesce and hopefully can be of value to you in some way, shape, or form, or at least lead you down a rabbit hole of healing some complex trauma. If that's some work that you need to do, is to now go towards Tim Fletcher and his work. I think if there's one person that I would advocate for as an incredibly powerful barrage of helpful information and diagnostic criteria, I think it's him. I think it's also, you have to be careful to not shame spiral as you start to collect all of the data and characteristics and stuff like that. Like that in and of itself is a practice in not saying like, oh my God, I'm all of these things. That's the being special thing, right? We're all unique, but none of us are special. And that's really hard to take in. I think that's the paradox of the victim and the narcissist, right? It's like they both feel like they're special. And when I say victim, I don't mean anyone who is actually a victim in the moment, but someone who is using that moment of having been a victim and carrying that with them as an identity. And we do that with childhood trauma. We do that with particularly moments of trauma or even perceived traumas, perceived injustices, perceived offenses that we just carry with us as I'm special, I'm wounded, etc. And if you listen throughout all of my podcast, I have so many episodes where I'm clearly just taking on the wounded character as part of who I am. Part of it has been the challenge of actually finding the breadth and depth of what fulfills the understanding of all of this, to let it go. And it's been a multi-step process. It's been letting go of blame. It's understanding that guilt has actually been a part of my story. I'm starting to understand guilt as something that is what keeps me from deep rest. And then shame as something that a weapon I turn on myself all the time to say like, because of my trauma, I did X, Y, and Z. Because of my trauma, the blame. And then I did X, Y, and Z, so I hurt people. That's the shame part. And basically the shame is continuing to tell yourself that you're a bad person. Even covertly, even again, if it comes out in the narcissistic direct way, underneath that all is like some version of I'm a bad person or I have to pay for something. And so shame is a big old complex thing. I did an episode, or I posted a video recently on dopamine.substack.com about the problem of shame. And shame is just, I see it as a pervasive thing. I think it's a challenge with a lot of young men in today's world. I think that's pervasive everywhere, honestly. I think it's going to really depend on your upbringing, how intensely you utilize it. But I did a thing about Jordan Peterson recently. I think that's very much what he's doing as well. Like there's probably a lot of shame in there. And ultimately it comes down to fear, a fear and anxiety that, that we are trying to hold on to some sort of specialness. And that's what any kind of authoritarian does, hold on to a specialness. One of the things that is supposed to be particularly special about healthy democracies is that we pass the torch of leadership. And I think in a way, what we do on an individual level when we're trying to be leaders or we're trying to be developing a skill or we're trying to bring our uniqueness to the world is that there is this flex flow that's this step up, step down relationship. And this specialness feels like this attempt to always keep ourselves up or always keep ourselves down. It's like picking a position and staying there instead of being adaptable, instead of flowing. And there's no surprise to me that if we're failing to adapt and we're creating this situation in which we are conceptually alone, if not literally alone, then we would start to develop suicidal ideation and start to say, I'm not worth being here. I'm not worth having friends. I'm not worth having a partner. I'm not worth anyone caring for me. And it just creates this spiral. The challenge I have with communicating all of this is that I have now a sense of how that feels in my mind and in my body to start to shame spiral. There is this kind of squeeze between the eyes, and there's almost like a color that comes to my mind is sort of like this purple, which is interesting because purple has always been the color for dopamine. But it is this sort of squeeze and everything just sort of sinks and I start to freeze up a little bit conceptually. I don't know if that's going to be universal. I don't know what that's going to feel like for someone, but it really is interesting to notice how someone can start to spiral. And for me, I start to spiral of like, oh no, I'm not good enough. I'm not doing well. I'm blah, 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 blah. Just it all stacks and creates this anxiety spiral of fear and shame and guilt and blame. And it's a lot. It's intense. And I think we need help. I think it's one thing to listen to me on a podcast or for me to watch Tim Fletcher's videos. Uh, but I'm talking to my wife about this, and I'm being more open about some of the things that I'm feeling that I normally wouldn't, even with her. Um, and it doesn't mean necessarily, puking your emotions on people. I don't think that's appropriate, but it is finding people who are willing to listen, who have healthy boundaries, who are willing to listen, and you can share some of your process with them. But ultimately, it really is reconciling with the fact that, and accepting that, you are who you are, and I am who I am, and that uh, it is an inherently lonely experience. Not lonely in the special sense, but lonely in the fact that you are unique. I am unique. I am the only one of me. I am the only person that I spend the entirety of my existence with. And that's not a special thing. All 8 billion people are doing that. All 8 billion people on the planet are experiencing fear, and they're experiencing love and sadness and happiness and joy and anxiety and restlessness and joy. I may have already said all those things, but it's there's this ego desire, which the ego is not a bad thing, but it is this sense of I amness, and we desire to have either artificially or literally this sense of superiority because it helps with our sense of the ability to survive. And if we can't, if we've had trouble literally adapting, then we can conceptually and psychologically create a superiority to feel like we've got it. I think Carl Jung used the word inflation. It's like this grandiosity. We create this sense of we're bigger than life itself, when even someone who is like the richest person in the world still takes a shit. you know, the prettiest supermodel in the world still takes a shit. The it's like everybody is wrestling with very similar stuff. We have very unique circumstances. And yes, there are people who have more money and people who have less money, but that's all made up. It's all conceptual. you know, uh, it's like we all get hungry and then we eat if we can. And part of that understanding our uniqueness versus specialness is helping to create the opportunity for more people to have their unique experience. And it's not necessarily like taking on the guilt of having to create a service or purpose for the self that is so unattainable, right? Like creating an unattainable goal, or creating a sense of, again, that's perpetuating grandiosity. Like your participation in existence does not have to save existence. There are 8 billion people participating. We're all in this. I think the only call that all of this brings forth is the call to expand the light of human consciousness. That includes yourself, to maybe pass on to your kids or anyone else that you come across. But I don't think it necessarily has to be like being the person that comes up with the carbon capture system that saves the environment. If that's your unique skill and your unique ability and your unique circumstance of having the money and the resources and the means and the talents and the desire, great. But whatever it is that your means and talent and desire is, you can pour that into something that is unique to you. That's individuation. That's a process of finding out what feels right and feels good. This week, I had a lot of challenge taking care of my kids, but I ultimately felt fulfilled in that process. I learned a lot about them psychologically. We dealt with conflict really well. We faced it directly. My stepson is dealing with some of this challenge of internal grandiosity and taking responsibility for choices that he makes, and that's an ongoing process. And I think I'm grateful that I personally have experienced it because I can relate to it and approach it gently but firmly, right? I think often there's this video on the pursuit of wonder about covert narcissism that I think is really helpful, and it's helpful in me understanding my relationship to my stepson, but is also helping me understand myself. When we come across someone that keeps saying like, I'm not great, I'm not that big of a deal, like that whole kind of spiral energy, um, and it's not about just responding to them and being like, no, that's not true, because then that just gives them more ammo. But I'm learning to approach it in a way that reflects it back. And maybe I need to think about this a little bit more to give a little more specific context for how to deal with it, because it's kind of an in process thing. But I know for when within myself, I think it does ultimately come down to this idea of like, no, 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 you're not special, whether that's positive or negative. You're not special in terms of better than anyone. You're not less than anyone either, right? So you're unique, you're you, but being you comes with responsibilities. Come with being with you means being adaptable. It means learning skills. It means you have your own story. It means you have your own process. And so when something happens, you need to recognize your role in it. You need to take responsibility for it. And you're not someone that is you're not magical. The world isn't happening to you. And ultimately that narcissism victimhood paradox, that specialness is this belief that you are the center of the universe and everything is happening to you or for you or because of you. And again, that's a lot of weight. That's a lot of, I wouldn't say responsibility, because responsibility is more about the about service, but it is a lot of pressure and vigilance. And so it is a way of taking the gas pedal off of the self to just let it go. Right now, it's not about you. Get your head out of your own ass, kind of thing. And it's really hard. It's really hard to communicate to someone else, and it really is about like understanding it for yourself, right? Um, and so I'm doing my best to communicate that and understand it for myself, because I can't. One of the things you can't really do to people is say that they're projecting. You just can't. They'll never listen. You can't point out what someone is doing. They just get defensive, right? So it's a covert challenge to support in a way that illuminates an idea or creates an awareness of something that doesn't dig the heels in deeper. So, one of the biggest challenges that I have is in this supporting of my son, who doesn't have the tools or the skills that I've had. And so some of it is supporting those skills. Some of it is creating the ability to have positive self-talk, because underneath it all is, like I've said, this like kind of fear of low sense of self-worth. And, I want to support a greater sense of self-worth and a greater sense of creativity and empowerment. So all of this kind of leads to, after all of this week with the kids, one thing that we changed, we've been working on something like screen time. Screen time is like this ever pervasive challenge as a modern parent, as a contemporary parent. And I realized that I'm not necessarily going to win the fight against screen time. It's like fighting the digital age. It's swimming against the stream. That's just not going to work. So my intentions have to be clear when I say that for the first 2 hours of the day, I want no screens, because I want your brain to rest. I want your dreams to coalesce. I want you to be able to have some time with yourself and to enjoy your own company. When we feel lonely or bored, we're not enjoying our own company. And that's something I want to really help both of my kids to be able to do, is enjoy their own company. Some of the challenges with screens and stuff is that we are so inundated with other things, not just kids, it's all of us that get very inundated with politics or the news or TikTok or YouTube shorts or whatever. And we are just not enjoying our own company. And if we can enjoy our own company, we can feel a little less lonely. And I lost my train of thought. uh, really, I was talking about screens. Yeah, so 2 hours to spend a lot of time with yourself. And so after those first 2 hours, I was like, how can we change this up? Because, well, it really happened by accident, I'll say. My kids started going through some of the stuff that I was going through. I have these like bins of just old technology, cords, I think every dude approaching your 40s or older has just like bins of cords. And so I was just like going through these things. I was just like, what can I get rid of? What can I consolidate? I just needed something to do, because if I was going to try to get my kids to be off of screens, I needed to be part of demonstrating it. So I was like, you know what? I need a break too. And I'm working on all of this. So I started going through stuff, and they came over. I think I handed them one or two things, and then they came over and they were like, do you got other old technology? Because I gave them like an old Nintendo 3DS, stuff like that. And so they just came and started going through stuff. And at one point, there was this MIDI keyboard that was just this keyboard you plug into the computer, and I never really used it. And so they got really excited about it. And my daughter just took it and she was like, mine. I was like, you can borrow it. It's not yours, but you can borrow it. And they just got excited about these, like, creativity tools. And I was like, well, that plugs into the computer. Why am I not supporting their ability to create using screens and to create using, various technologies that I have? And I've been a creator for 20 years. I've been a multimedia designer for 20 years. Why has it not occurred to me to, I guess it's a challenge of being an intuitive. They answer right in front of my face that I've been a designer for 20 years and I have the ability to teach and support, software. Like you can use software to like play with making music or drawing or whatever the case may be, editing video, stuff like that. And so I plugged it into the computer, plugged the MIDI controller in there, and I found a program, and they just started playing with the effects and doing all of that stuff. I'm like, this is a way better use of screen time. I feel so much better about this. And I love video games. I'm very supportive of video games. But I know that over the course of basically two things really stuck out to me. One, I noticed that there are schools in Ohio that are starting to take phones away from schools. There was like a CBS Sunday morning news thing on it, and they noticed a 40% reduction in bullying. That is notable. That is incredibly potent. And then I was watching the show by with Caesar Milan, the dog whisperer. It's on Disney Plus, and it's very good. It's about I think it's called like Better Dog, Better Human, Better Dog, or something like that. And it is about the psychology that's shared between humans and animals. And there was one episode in particular where there was a dog. There was two episodes. There was one episode of that show where there was a dog that was constantly mentally stimulated but did not get enough physical activity. And so the dog was just like, there was a lot of people coming to the house and a lot of people talking in the house. It was just like a lot of chatter, a lot of mental activity. And so the dog was restless and would basically get into fights with other dogs. Or the second the dog would get out on a walk, would be trying to pick fights. And so I couldn't help see a correlation between all of the mental activity and aggression. And then it's the same thing with there was another dog on a TikTok I saw with the same kind of trainer guy that was not Caesar Milan, but a different kind of trainer, that the dog was just not allowing for any unapproved movement to happen with other dogs. And I think this was a trauma thing for the dog in particular, but it was also related to a lot of mental activity. So I just started noticing in my kids, like, not only just the amount of screen time, but what they were doing. I started by taking away YouTube. I just took YouTube off the TVs and the iPad and just said, no, we're not going to do YouTube here because it's the type of content, and YouTube isn't really built for kids, even though they have a YouTube Kids app. It really still is up to the creator to toggle whether something is or is not for kids. And there are not really like parental tools that prevent them from just like logging into my account and looking at other stuff. So all of that being said, I just noticed this link between mental aggression and bullying each other. The second they would get off of screens after a lot of mental activity and heightened activity, they would start poking at each other. Now, my daughter is just kind of trolly, so she'll do that anyway, but it just sort of amped up. And so I started to do the creativity changes and started to manage the amount of screen time, or at least make sure that there's breaks in between, and make sure that there is mind-body connection. And it was a massive help, a massive change in the ability for them to be present and to be kinder to each other, and subsequently, I believe, being kinder to themselves. And because they're able to spend more time with themselves. I think the next morning after a particular episode, and my son was having challenges with sleeping too, the next morning I was like, okay, we're going to go an extended amount of time. I'm not going to tell them when they get screen time. We're just going to go the morning without it. And even for me as a parent is like, sort of feels like marathoning a little bit, because I get anxiety. I get anxious about like, well, what are they going to do? They're just going to bug me. And, I have to recognize how much of my own generational tendency to just put them on the screen to just satisfy my own discomfort. Right. So with all of that, I'm recognizing that supporting them and figuring them out psychologically has been giving me a really great sense of purpose this last week. It's been really hard, but it's providing a great sense of purpose that is getting me out of my own ass. Getting my head out of my ass and stopping the spirals that I'd get into around, I'm not doing enough, I'm not helping, I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable, my wife's going to leave me. People are going to find out things about me and they're going to leave and no one's going to trust me. Like, that's kind of the energy, is just just a sad dog. And spiral. So throughout all of this, I actually am going to start a new project called Digital Dad. It's a YouTube channel. It's also on Substack here. So it's digitaldad.substack.com. There's no posts yet. But what I think I'm going to do is start to support parents through my own exploration of, these kind of psychological things that are helpful to kids and understanding them. And things like immersion and how helpful that is for the mind. Immersion being minimum 45 minutes, which is why I'm kind of talking for a little longer than usual and doing a longer podcast. And with that immersion comes the ability to rest into your own mind and, really be present with something. And, while I test these things out, to share podcasts or talking head stuff, but then also demos of video games that I think are really interesting, maybe educational or very creative, or support creative tools, and allow for kids to use the screens in creative ways, to not just be consumers, but to be creators. And that really starts to move them, and to move me, frankly, by being part of this project, by potentially creating tutorials and things like that too, to talk to parents and kids both differently. Like, I'll do maybe playthrough videos and mark those as for kids, and then talking head videos for parents. That it's moving me away from the victim side of things and moving me into being a creator. And I recognize that when I have difficulty sleeping, or I've gotten into manic episodes, or I've just had these challenges over and over again, one of the key components is that I've been inputting too much and not outputting enough. Right? So this feels very good, actually. It's like It's like taking a good poop. Another poop reference. Um, it's really just the ability to recognize that our brain has this input, process, output. I've talked about this in past episodes, actually, that we input a lot of information, or, you know, information being just general, not literally just like data in terms of like scientific facts or anything, but consuming media, consuming relational things, taking in all sorts of stuff. And then we process it and remix it through our own experience, through our unique experience. And then we create something from it. We do some writing or talking or drawing or poetry or whatever. And we put that into some sort of creative act. And I think creativity is so incredibly powerful and important, not just because I've been a designer for 20 years, but and my wife and I have a podcast called Behind the Studio Door, and we're very immersed in the art community. But I think art and creativity is just a very natural, healthy part of the human experience. And I think we're at this kind of tail end of this work right now, where life has been a lot more about consuming than producing. And there is so much to consume. There's so many books, there's so many amazing things to take in. Uh, but it is very natural. It's a need. It's like I said, with reproductive needs. I think that includes creativity. We have a need to create and to output, and that's incredibly valuable. So I'm going to be working on this project called Digital Dad, and do effectively what I've had others do for me on YouTube, which is like when I'm trying to put a TV on the wall, watching a guy, turn a wrench. Like, here you go, buddy. I'm like, yeah, thanks, Digital Dad. so, so I'm going to be that in terms of software tools and things that kids can play with on maybe the iPad or the Nintendo Switch or the PC or something like that. I don't have an idea for the content yet. I have a couple ideas I want to play with, but I think that's ultimately where I'm going to go. Because right now, this podcast, Dopamine, has just been, if anything, there'll probably be fewer episodes because I'm figuring stuff out. As I'm finally figuring things out, it's like there's just going to be less to talk about. And I guess that's the last thing, is that the internet is a challenge because there's so much centered around diagnostics on the internet. It is so easy to reinforce a belief we already have about being a victim. It's so easy to, have a weird rash on your foot, and then you go to WebMD and it's like cancer, and you're like, son of a bitch, I'm dying. When you go to the doctor and they look at it and they're like, oh, that'll be, here's a cream, it'll be gone in a week, right? But if you don't, you just keep looking up the diagnostic, you just keep panicking about it, and then maybe you create a cancer by panicking about it for years, versus just doing something about it, just seeing an expert. And that's why I invite you to go check out Tim Fletcher. Crappy Childhood Fairy is another one that's really great on YouTube. And I'm not an expert. I've just been a person that's been stuck in the diagnostic spiral for years. And hopefully this podcast has been helpful to you in some way, shape, or form. But I think if you are truly serious about wanting to heal and move forward, it's going to be about allowing other people to help, and enjoying your own company, and recognizing that if you are dealing with suicidal ideation or some sort of addiction, there is probably a need underlying that is needing to be met. And it might not be the same thing. You might be using an addiction to meet a different need, right? You might be using um, porn addiction in replacement of relational needs. Like, you might not need, like, it might not be suggesting that you need physical pleasure from the opposite sex or the sex that you're attracted to, but that you might just need a hug, and you might need someone to listen to you. Or you might need some good food because you might not have had good food in a while. It just might be something else. in there. And I think approaching Tim's videos and looking for the 12 needs might be a good sense of all of that. So I think that wraps up everything I wanted to talk about. I think if I'm going to quickly review all of this, or if there's a central idea, I think it's that you're unique, but you're not special. And it sounds paradoxical, right? There are just so many voices out there saying like, yeah, you got this, and empower you, and empowering each other and trying to create this artificial specialness. But there's just so much inflated grandiosity out there that I think there is a healthy sense of modesty, psychological modesty, that is necessary. Express yourself in all sorts of different forms. Again, you're unique, but you're not special. You're not better than anybody else. You're not less than anyone else, unless it's a part of a very specific competition. But that's just a matter of skill and talent. Well, there's a lot of things that nearly anybody could do. And if it's not your arena, that's part of your uniqueness. Go somewhere else. Go discover your uniqueness. Go discover your individual path. And it's not a greater or less than thing. It's just who you are and where you are and what you need to do, if that all makes sense. So with that said, same old typical stuff, dopamine.substack.com. If you want to subscribe, that'd be fantastic. You can support this project by being a premium subscriber. That's really just kind of a Patreon level donation here on Substack. That would be fantastic to support this work that I've done up to this point, even if there isn't going to be a lot going forward. And you can go check out Digital Dad. I think it's going to be right now. It's youtube.com/@a-digital-dad. It's @@a-digital-dad. And I'll start posting some stuff soon, hopefully. And digitaldad.substack.com. And you can follow that project and see what's going on there. I appreciate you. I hope that you can find some service, be of service in a simple way. Just feed someone, go say hi. Be kind to yourself. Get out of your own head. Take a breath. Enjoy life. Everything's going to be all right. All right. Much love. I have been C-Note, and I'll talk to you next time on Dopamine. See ya.